You may
Can I make a
have
start?
the stage.
Awesome. All right. Well, hello everyone. If you don't know who I am, I'm Hady. I'm a PhD student at the University of Bristol, and I'm here to present on a project I've recently completed that reviews the Upper Cretaceous Lebanese Lagerstatten. So first, to give some very basic intro, Lagerstatten are these basically sites of exceptional fossil preservation, and they're often argued to be our clearest windows into the past. I'm sure you're familiar with many of the very famous ones, such as the Burgess Shale, the Solnhofen, and the Messel Pit, all of which have produced these iconic fossil animals that have told us so much about the evolution of all sorts of bizarre and extraordinary life forms, everything from like the Cambrian explosion to the rise of birds and mammals later on. And the fossils from the Upper Cretaceous Lebanese Lagerstatten are in a way quite similar. Similar to these ones, you get these essentially whole bodies preserved with extensive soft tissues, and there's so much anatomy that you can discern and describe and understand. And before we can get into each individual fossil group and talk a bit more about them in more depth, I first want to give a very general intro into where are these sites, how old they are, and things like that. So there really are actually at least 7 Lagerstadt sites in Lebanon, but there are 4 that are really well understood, much more than any of the others, and that's the focus of what I'll be talking about today. And these are Hakil, Hajula, Namura, and Sahel Alma. Each of which can technically be considered a Lagerstadt in its own right, with its own unique depositional environment and a paleo environment, I guess, and age and fauna and flora even. We have, for example, Sahel Alma, which is late Santonian in age, or maybe 85-ish million years old, represents possibly a marine continental slope, and it's here we get all sorts of deep sea animals, such as goblin sharks or chimera. And I should note that the ages of these sites are based off of ammonite and forearm biostratigraphy. And then we have Namura, which is the oldest of these 4, which is early to mid-Calamanian in age. It represents an intercontinental shelf, and is known for many reptiles it's yielded, and all sorts of terrestrial plants, and even a bird, for example. And we also have Hakil and Ahjula, which are the 2 most studied. We have most taxa from these sites and most specimens as well. They're the most fossiliferous of these 4 sites. And they're well known for their extensive fish records, all sorts of teleosts and sharks and rays, but even stuff like octopuses and pterosaurs even. And just to give a bit more background on these sites, it's at these sites you get these very fine-grained laminated limestones, quite similar to those at, for example, Solnhofen, although not understood to the same amount. And these fossil localities sit between these rolling green hills and the mountains of Lebanon. This is Hakil and Hajura. Namura is also quite similar as well. You can see these very fine-grained laminated limestones in the bottom left. And Sahel Alma, which is unfortunately now no longer accessible, here's a very old picture of a monastery that was built on this fossil locality. And about 50 years ago or something like that, this monastery was acquired by a private company and turned into a hotel. So there's no longer any fossil collecting happening here, unfortunately. But it also has a very similar, in a sense, geology to the other 3 sites. And now to go into a bit more of the fascinating fossil groups and the extraordinary fossils. Namura has produced all sorts of plants, from angiosperms and gymnosperms and others. This is one of my favorites, this beautiful slab and counterslab of the angiosperm Sapindopsis. And what's quite fascinating and remarkable about Namura's plants is that collectively they show all sorts of adaptations that are quite similar as those of modern Mediterranean plants, indicating that at the time any sorts of shoreline or islands would have been covered in vegetation very similar to what you get today in Lebanon, along the coast. This is in the coast of South Lebanon shown here. You would have quite similar sort of vegetation, such as the part on the left. And of course, these sites are best known for their fossil fauna, all sorts of arthropods. There are dozens of shrimp species. This is one of the really cool ones in my opinion. This apparently deep sea crested shrimp. Sahel Alma is often thought to be very deep sea, but it's unclear exactly how deep it is. It does seem to be deeper than the other 3 sites, but unclear if it's really like several hundreds upon hundreds of meters. But regardless, we get these really weird crested shrimp from Sahel Alma. And we get all sorts of lobsters as well, such as very typical lobsters, very similar to modern lobsters like Notohamaris. We even get members of this very bizarre and enigmatic group of lobsters called slipper lobsters. There are multiple taxa known from Hajula, like Paracancrinus, for example. We even have thylacocephalans. Thylacocephalans are a group that is wholly extinct. There are no modern representatives of this group. but we have several species, up to 8 genera from Sahel Alma alone. We got several species for some of them, such as Protozoa, which is quite fascinating. How we've learned so much about this really bizarre and mysterious group just from these sites, and a few others around the world. We even have some terrestrial arthropods, which is quite unusual, such as these dragonflies from Mahjula, indicating that possibly it was closer to land than has been previously suggested. And we even have all sorts of fossil polychaetes, almost all of which are represented by fragments of jaws and stuff like that. The whole animal doesn't really tend to preserve well. But a great exception to this is Rolinskita, which is unusually preserved with extensive musculature in several specimens. This allows identification of this taxon to a fireworm, as a fireworm, to a family level, which is a very rare thing among fossil polychaetes. They're often just polychaete indeterminate. And of course, these sites are best known for their fossil fishes. They're often described as famous fish beds, and in fossil shops all around the world you can find examples of these fossil fishes. We have stuff from like hagfish, like this holotype of Tepimixine, that is preserved with extensive soft tissue, like all sorts of slime glands, intestines, and possibly even a heart. We get all sorts of cartilaginous fishes as well, like this carpet shark. We have 2 preserved right next to each other, and really beautifully preserved fossil rays, like this skate pararaja. And my favorite of the cartilaginous fishes are the fossil goblin sharks, which show that this rostrum has been around for at least 100 million years. And this one here is from Sahel Alma, so this one's slightly younger than the other ones, and this one's about 85-ish million years, but it's extensively well preserved. You can see the entire rostrum. And there are so many other bony fishes. So we have like coelacanth, like Macropomoides, and a great number of teleosts. I think over 70 species of teleosts, just from Hakel alone, I believe. We have taxa like Exocoetoides, like these fishes that have independently evolved, like the flying fish body plan. We even have taxa like Spinoscutictes that are trying to look like a crocodile in some way, very elongated bodies, very long snouts, and armor. And we even have Armigatus, which is known from mass mortality assemblages, slabs with dozens of dead individuals all together. There are even clades that are wholly endemic to the Cenomanian of Lebanon, from Hakel and Ahjula, such as Abisadictes and the whole group Protobramidae, these early relatives of teleosts. And we have some very bizarre pycnodonts as well that are completely endemic to the Cenomanian, like the Gibrail ichthyids with this super bizarre body plan. It's very tall but not very long. And even the cocodontids as well. Here's an example of a possible cocodontid. I'm not 100% convinced this is definitely Cocodus, but it's one of the several examples of fishes from these sites that is preserved eating another fish, all of which I believe are undescribed. And there are other undescribed animals as well, such as these fossil protostegids. There are several turtles that have not been described. And we even have other reptiles besides these turtles, like Mimodactylus, the best preserved pterosaur from these sites, from Mahjula, whereas most reptiles come from Namura, including these squamates, like these stem snakes, mosasaurs, these dolichosaurs. I'm not sure exactly what they are, but we have taxa like Pontosaurus, and we even have these hind-limbed snakes like Eupodophis. And it's even been reported that there was a hand of a theropod recovered from Namura. It's unclear what sort of theropod this is. It's unfortunately been lost to science now. Possibly represents some sort of large raptor, or maybe something very big, like one of the large theropods that you get from like the Cenomanian of North Africa. And what might be the most, like the crown jewel of these fossils are the stem octopus fossils, or all the octopus fossils really, from Ahjula and Sahel Alma. There are very few sites in the world that produce really good octopus fossils that tell us so much about how these animals have evolved and how their internal soft tissue anatomy and body plan has changed over millions of years. But fascinatingly, these 2 sites have produced several species together, collectively. And they've told us so much about the internal soft tissue anatomy of these stem and even crown group octopuses. But despite how much there is in terms of fossil taxa, in terms of how many specimens there are, and in terms of how fossiliferous they are, there's a great paucity, really lack of knowledge, or lack of research, rather, on these animals. For example, many of the turtles have not been described, and many of the fishes, such as these bizarre, independently evolved flying fish, and these goblin sharks, have not really been described in decades, if not hundreds of years. And nowadays we also have all sorts of new ways of looking at these old fossils, such as UV light, which can tell us more about the hard skeletal tissue anatomy, and laser stimulated fluorescence, which can show us so much about the soft tissue preservation. Some of the fossils from Lebanon have been studied in ways such as these, like the slipper lobsters or the hagfish, but most of them haven't, despite having the potential to be studied like this, because of their exceptional preservation. And because we have so many taxa and so many specimens, it's even possible to form to come up with food webs focused on trophic interactions that's either based on direct evidence, such as fishes eating other fishes, or indirect evidence, such as taxa with adaptations for hunting certain other taxa, such as Mebodactylus, which has allegedly these teeth that are specialized for eating crustaceans. I think there's a lot that we can understand about the ecology of these sites as well, that has not been looked into. And many of these specimens also likely preserve melanosomes, which can give us good insight into the possible colors these animals might have had back in their day, which has been like a major focus of research on all sorts of dinosaurs, for example, and there's no reason why this can't be done on many of these beautifully preserved fossils from these sites either. And there's many things about the sites themselves that we don't understand either. It's not just about the uncertainty surrounding the fossils themselves. Much of the taphonomy is unclear. It's not exactly clear what exactly was the kill mechanism that allowed so many things to die and to preserve so well. It's been suggested that algal blooms, these sorts of red tides, were like the primary kill mechanism. But there's been no evidence for this so far that has been published in the literature, at least. And the stratigraphy is basically, we don't know anything about it in a sense. There's very, very little that has been done, which is unlike other sites, such as the Burgess Shale, that has been extensively studied in this regard. And I think it's a shame that there's so much that we can know about these sites but we don't know, because no one's looked into it. Because we have known about these sites for ages, absolute ages. As in, we have known about them since the ancient Roman Empire. About 1,600 years ago, a bishop of the time recorded some of these fossils, and he said he documented these fishes pressed into the mud. And he even argued that this was evidence for the old story being true, the old story being the biblical flood. And this isn't the only historical documentation of these fossils. We even have documentation from the Crusades, from the Seventh Crusade. While King Louis IX of France was planning his invasion of Egypt from the Levant, he was gifted a fossil fish, likely from the monastery at Sahel Alma, which is now the hotel. And this was recorded by a chronicler at the time. But of course, enthusiasm for these fossils and actual modern scientific research on these fossils wouldn't begin until the 18th and 19th century, in the age of colonialism. We had many Europeans come to Lebanon, well, what is Lebanon now, at the time, and organize major fossil hunting expeditions and write the first scientific papers on these fossils. We have people like Lady Hester Stanhope, a British aristocrat, who moved to what is now Lebanon, and organized many fossil collection trips. People like Henri de Blainville, who allegedly coined the term paleontology, described the first fossil fish from Lebanon, and Arthur Woodward, one of the first experts on fossil fishes, worked on all sorts of specimens and taxa of fishes from these Lebanese fossil sites. And in modern day, fieldwork is led largely by locals instead of by Europeans or other foreigners coming through Lebanon. It's largely led by local families, such as this is the Abi Saad family. That's Pierre on the bottom left. Pierre has supplied many of the photos used throughout this presentation and is a collaborator in this review. And this local-led work has allowed for even small museums to be erected throughout Lebanon, such as the Memory of Time Museum in the coastal city of Byblos, which is full of these beautifully preserved fossils, most of which are from Haken. And I think what's quite fascinating as well is that not only do these fossils alone have a great heritage, but for the Lebanese, but they also have a strong connection with the Maronite Church, and there's a nice interplay here between the religious heritage and the geo-heritage of these sites. But of course, many of the fossils aren't in Lebanon. Many of them are kept abroad, thanks to the fossil trips that were organized hundreds of years ago. And these are mainly collected in places like in London, in Paris, and Milan, and this largely prevents researchers based in Lebanon from working on these fossils. So in our review, we wanted to take a more quantitative look at this and identify how much exactly has the impact of colonialism had on the extraction of fossils from Lebanon. And when we looked into it, we found that hundreds of fossils of holotypes alone are stored abroad, especially in places like in London, in Paris, several places in Italy, and even in America, and that only 3% of holotype descriptions actually include collaborators from Lebanese institutions. And this got us curious, is this a product of the time? Is this legacy? Is it getting better the last few years? So we wanted to map this out over time as well. And we saw that actually, despite Lebanon's tumultuous past over the last 100 years, that very little has changed over the last 20 years or so. There isn't much inclusion of Lebanon-based authors in these publications. So it doesn't really seem to be getting much better than it was at the turn of this century. I think this is quite interesting because this isn't actually despite having that Lebanon-based authors seem to collaborate with people from all sorts of countries all over the world, from Japan to the USA to Brazil. So the connections, at least some connections, do exist. And of course, this brings us into how do we actually interrogate this colonial legacy, and how do we make things better? How do we make a more equitable global community, a research community? As I'm sure we're all familiar with the growing literature on this topic, and just the growing discussion on this topic in general, such as in the case of Ubi Rahara, and even with Irritator as well, in recent years. Is there anything we can do in the case of Lebanon? Is it in a similar situation to places like Brazil and stuff like that? Is there any hope for repatriation in the near future? And I think, unfortunately not. I think the economic crisis that has plagued Lebanon over the last 5 years has massively impacted public services in general. There's barely any funding for research and employment in general throughout universities, museums in the country. And I don't think it's really feasible or practical to repatriate fossils that can't be properly curated, maintained, and researched. And of course, as I'm sure we're all seeing in the news, the security situation in Lebanon isn't getting much better either. It's unclear if there's going to be any major escalation soon, and once again, this is a barrier to repatriation. But I don't want to leave it on a pessimistic note, because while I do think that repatriation and true decolonization isn't realistic in the coming few years, I don't think this means that we can't still make it more equitable and provide more Lebanon-based researchers access to fossils and technology abroad through increased collaboration. And also which would in turn provide foreign researchers access to fieldwork in Lebanon by building these networks. These are really easy sites to access and to collect fossils at. And I think together this would increase we really able to celebrate the fossil sites in general, these incredible fossils that we find, and allow many researchers based in Lebanon this indirect access to fossils and technology as well that's based abroad, such as micro CT scanners and other sorts of state-of-the-art technology as really makes modern paleontology what it is. So I think this sort of increased collaboration that can pave the way for decolonization in the future as well, and might even provide a framework for other developing countries that are going through similar economic situations as well. And finally, thank you so much for listening to my talk. I'll give a big thanks to my co-authors as well who helped make the review happen that this talk is based on, and many others who helped to make it happen, and it should be coming out hopefully in the coming few weeks. Thank you all so much for listening.